Hello everyone and welcome to my low elo tier list for patch 14.14. I don't do the low elo tier list as often because the champs tend to remain mostly the same. But I'll do one now mainly because there's a new champ in the game and also there's just some things I've changed my opinions on. So as a reminder, this tier list is for low elo players playing in low elo. It's not for smurfing in low elo. It's not for, low elo players looking to improve. I do have an improvement tier list that Coach Curtis and I made, which is on my channel, which you can go check with some detailed explanations for all the champs. But this is purely a guide for how to win in low elo as a low elo player. So generally, the champs that are going to be higher on the list are going to be champs that find it very easy to have consistent impact in pretty much every game. These could be champs that are easier to play and often will be, but a lot of the time they will just be champs that have like a lot of AoE or a lot of impact, even if you kind of play bad or you don't play optimally. The champs that tend to be at the bottom of the list are going to be champs that are extremely difficult to play or are, quite difficult to either make sure you have high impact on or have some kind of win condition that is not very easy, I guess, to wrap your head around. So an example, I guess, could be something like Vlad. Like, even though Vlad is kind of simple mechanically, this is a champ that really needs to make sure they're like farming and side laning a lot. You need to find flanks and stuff. So basically, even though this champ is simple mechanically, there's some very difficult elements to him that I would recommend low elo players stay away from. So what I'll do is I'll go through most of the top champs on this list, and then again, I will talk briefly about some of the lower tiers. As always, if you want more detailed explanations, I would really check out the improvement guide that Coach Curtis and I did, since it'll be much more in depth. Well, let's start with S tier. So I've got Vex at the very top. I think Vex is the champ that I recommend to new players the most. I think Vex is a combination of a champ that is super fun to play while also being like pretty easy to pick up and almost always has really high impact. She's got great wave clear, which means CSing is very easy. And also she just does a lot of damage. Even when you're feeding, you'll most likely get, big CC, big damage when you dive into the enemy team. So I really, really highly recommend Vex. Next, we have Swain. So Swain is another king of low elo. He's extremely easy to play and very easy to have high impact on. He's very tanky. A lot of the weaknesses that Swain normally has, he's not going to face in low elo. So, for example, people cutting out your ult or punishing you for your weak laning phase and stuff like that. It's very easy just to be a Swain, and as long as you make sure you don't fight without ult, you're pretty much always going to have high impact. Brand is like very similar. Brand is another champ where like you can make a lot of mistakes on this champ and still end up topping the damage meters. So the thing with Brand is that, yeah, your combos are super simple, your team fight is super simple. Basically, everything is super straightforward, and it's, again, super easy to have really high impact. The main weakness of Brand is getting punished by other mage laners, but just straight up in lower elo, this is probably not going to happen. Actually, you will find yourself bullying pretty much every lane. So Brand is another champ that I feel like is almost a cheat code for getting out of low elo, and something I would definitely recommend. I also have a video in my Unranked to Master series, if you go to playlists on my channel, of me playing Brand mid, I think in like, maybe it's just Emerald or something, so you can definitely go a bit higher with him, but yeah, really, really broken for the lower elos. Next is Malzahar, and I've moved Malzahar down a little bit. So the thing with Malz is I think that if he gets out of lane, he's really, really good, right? Like his build path is super, super strong. You can just end up dealing a ton of damage with like Blackfire, Liandry, Raleigh into Deathcap. I think the only negatives really of Malz is that his early lane is actually very bad, and I think that chances are in low elo you won't get punished for it as much. But I still think you might take some damage in the early game, and there's a big difference between a Malzahar that gets chapter on like first or second base compared to a Malzahar that gets chapter kind of like way beyond that point, just because they're a bit too far behind. I also think that positioning as Malz is a bit more difficult than some of these other champs. If you think of well, Vex, you're probably not going to be engaged on most of the time. You've also got great self-peel. These champs, even if they die, chances are you will have had a lot of impact on the fight already. Whereas Malz, if you do get picked randomly, it is a DPS champ, right? So if you end up dying before the team fight starts, it can be really bad. So just because there's some positioning requirements made me put him a tiny bit lower, but I still think he's very good. I still think he's a very good low elo champ. Galio is super nice. I think especially with the tank Galio build, it's super easy just to have a lot of impact. So the tank Galio build is you go Hollow Radiance into Riftmaker into Liandry, which I think is super strong, especially against AP champs. If you're playing against an AD mid, you can go Sunfire first, but I'm not a huge fan of just regular Sunfire. I kind of like the just going Riftmaker and then like Zhonya's Liandry, or like Riftmaker. You can even go like Riftmaker, Liandry, Frozen Heart, or you can sit on a Steel Caps, go Riftmaker, Liandry, and then just buy whatever you want after that. So there's definitely options with Galio, but I think, yeah, especially the tank variant, it's super easy just to kind of pull up to fights and have a lot of AoE impact while, making sure that you don't just like aren't the first person to die. You can't really get picked randomly. I guess the only really big difficulty of Galio in lower elos is maybe farming, which I think, I don't know, to me it's not that hard, especially with the Sunfire, but I think you can definitely like fall behind in CS if you kind of just like ignore it completely. So that's something to keep an eye on, but overall pretty good. And to be honest, even if you have low CS, it's probably going to be pretty impactful. Diana is probably the easiest AP assassin to play in low elo. She's a very good stat check champion and can just basically force trades and win them all the time, which is super nice because it means you don't really have to think about stuff like punishing cooldowns or like choosing your windows or anything. You pretty much can just engage. I would say the biggest difficulty of Diana and something that gives her like, yeah, I guess some hidden difficulty is choosing your moments in the fights. You can go in a bit too early and end up being useless. And that is like the biggest thing that would maybe, make me drop her out of S tier. Compared to these champs where pretty much anytime you go in, you're going to have high impact. If you go in as Diana, you choose the wrong target or you just only find one target, it can be kind of low impact, to be honest. So that's definitely something to be aware of. But I think that strength is easily overcome if you just think about your team fights just a little bit. Naafiri is another really good one. So the nice thing about Naafiri is her scaling is great. And also she gets very tanky, which means that, even if you make some mistakes in terms of choosing when to go in and stuff, you should actually be able to survive. I'm a really big fan of Naafiri, and I think Naafiri as a champ actually is quite overpowered. It's just Naafiri is gatekept out of high elo by the champs that bully her in lane, basically. So the problem is that Naafiri as a counter pick doesn't really beat the blind picks, but also she herself is not blind pickable. That being said, in low elo, when you're not going to get punished for this, I think Naafiri is just broken. Like, if you could pick Naafiri in high elo and not get punished for your early game, I really do think she'd be picked a lot. So I think Naafiri is honestly one of the best champs in the game in elos where you're just not going to get punished that much early, and low elo happens to be that. So I really, really highly recommend Naafiri, especially if you're looking for an AD mid right now, because there are a lot of AP junglers. I'm not sure if AP jungler is like super common in low elo, but if it is, I'd highly, highly recommend Naafiri as your AD mid. Annie's my last one on here. So I think Annie actually does have like a fairly high skill cap in terms of like, using your E movement speed in order to trade, positioning with the bear and stuff. In order to block skill shots and making sure it stays alive to regen. So there is some high skill to this. At the same time, though, it's super easy just to like drop your bear on cooldown on your lane opponent and make it super hard for them to lane. I also think the laning runes on Annie are really good. Like if you play something like Ahri Resolve or even Ahri Domination, this champ is super, super strong in lane. And I think she's actually underrated even in high elo. It's a champ that I've encountered a few times on Korea in high elo. And honestly, I swear to God, Annie's broken. But yeah, because she's relatively easy to play, at least she has a low skill floor, even if she has like a decent skill ceiling. I think it's a champ that succeeds really well in low elo. So next we're going to move on to A tier, and these are champs that are kind of, they might have some difficulties in terms of there might be one difficult thing about their kit, or they might be a bit more punishable, or maybe they just have like a bit lower impact in general. But I'll go through them and explain them. So Fizz is a really, really nice AP assassin. I mean, the one really nice thing about Fizz is he's got very good wave clear, which is something that, again, in lower elo, people tend to really struggle with farming. So having the high wave clear as Fizz is super, super nice. Probably the biggest mistake I see people make with Fizz is either losing the game too early, like before they hit their level 3 spike, or just taking too many fights without ulti, because there are a lot of fights in low elo, and until you get fed as Fizz, you do need to be quite careful. I also think it is possible you get outscared as Fizz. Like in the ultra late game, Fizz is not that good when people get a lot of MR. That being said, I think itemization can go a long way on Fizz. Just making sure, and I am going to make an AP itemization guide, making sure you have in your full build a death cap and a void or a crypt bloom. I think that is like very, very important to making sure you don't get ultra outscaled. Because a lot of the time I see Fizz builds, end up at like 5 or 6 items with just a bunch of like, random stuff, and then you're like super low on AP. And even though you've got all this utility, you don't actually deal any damage anymore. Lux is the next one. I think Lux is kind of sleeper. I think similar to Naafiri, Lux is a champ that would be played way more often if she didn't have some really annoying lane counters. So the nice thing about Lux is into assassins, you can just play barrier, which is very, very strong, and you pretty much can't be killed. Into any range champ, you can just play TP. You've got an extremely strong laning phase, and that is something you should look to abuse. And probably the biggest difference between good Lux players and great Lux players is making sure you do play your lane phase while, getting lots of E-poke. Trying to find orders with your passive proc, I think, is really important. Even like trying to trade aggressively with your shield goes a pretty long way. And in team fights, Lux is very, very good. The nice thing about Lux is that you can have a lot of impact pretty non-committally. I don't know if that's a word, but without committing. I guess that's how you're meant to say it. You can have a lot of impact without committing. So like if you hit a binding, someone like dies or gets chunked to half HP. If you don't, like it's fine, right? It's hard to punish you. a champ like Cinder, right, if she overcommits with her E, she'll probably be engaged on and die because she's like relatively short range. Whereas a champ like Lux, you can position so far away that even with that Q being down, a lot of the time you can't be punished. So another champ I think is quite good. Ahri's the next one, and Ahri maybe could be a bit lower on this list. So the thing I really like about Ahri is that she is going to be very hard to punish. Even if you make mistakes, you have lots of chances to make up for that. So you've got pretty good wave clear, you've got good sustain, you've got good mobility. So these are all things that kind of give you get out of jail free cards for making mistakes, either in skirmishes or in lane or whatever. That being said, Ahri is not a champ that just has consistent impact in the same way that you can't just pull up to a fight and deal top damage in the way like a Brand or something. So in that sense, like, you kind of need to make sure you do work on stuff like your team fighting and laning as Ahri, because even though this will help make up for a lot of deficiencies in your gameplay, like let's say you're really bad at playing around junglers or you don't ward or whatever, Ahri can band-aid fix a lot of those problems and allow you to get to higher low through that. But Ahri is not going to band-aid fix problems like poor team fighting or poor laning, or I guess sort of poor laning, but poor aggressive laning, I guess is what I mean. Whereas like a champ like Brand, you know, again, doesn't really need to win lane, and also if you die first in a team fight, it's completely fine. So there is definitely some difficulties to Ahri, and like maybe that could put her a bit lower on the list. Personally, I think just because of her forgiveness, she still makes it very high for me, but I can definitely see the other side of it. Next is Taliyah, and this might be the most controversial pick on the list, because I think there are a lot of people that consider Taliyah to be extremely hard. Personally, and I've said this before, I genuinely think you could get to Diamond on Taliyah without skilling your W or your R. I'm pretty sure. The reason for that is that even though there is like high skill to Taliyah, right? If you use your W really well, it's obviously going to change skirmishes. It's really good in lane. Your R can be used to temper cheat, right? It can be used to get back to lane, get the skirmishes quicker, to make roams happen, all these things. But the thing is, Taliyah is not on the clock. Taliyah is an extremely good scaling champ, and if you get to the teamfight stage, I swear to God, even if you miss every W, purely with just QE spam, you will top damage. This champ is extremely good, especially in the meta right now, because there are a lot of melees, especially melee supports being played, and Taliyah is very, very good against that. So I think Taliyah is, if you're kind of like wanting to play a control mage, but you're not really sure where to start, I think that Taliyah is a really, really good place to look at. Next is Lissandra, and so Lissandra is similar to Taliyah in a lot of ways, in that I think there is like a lot of skill to like using your prio as Lissandra, and you know, choosing your targets, choosing whether to ult yourself or to ult an opponent or something like that. But I honestly think, you know, Lissandra just again is kind of like Brand in the sense that, you know, if you go in and you get assists and, you know, manage to tag people, you can end up dealing a really like huge amount of damage, even if you just die very early, because your zombies are going to have such high impact on the fight. So I really, really like Lissandra, and I also think Lissandra has a very like clear game plan, and that you don't really need to play that aggressive in lane. You just focus mainly on like, you know, harassing your opponent a little bit early, and then just focus on pushing and moving, trying to play with your jungler, and then just having like a wealth of CC and just high impact in every fight. I think goes a really, really long way in high low, or sorry, in low elo, which I think is very, very valuable. But like I said, there is some difficulty to Lissandra, and the nice thing about this is she's a champ that could take you way higher. You know, some of the champs on this list you might reach a cap with eventually, even though you can reach challenger with champs like Brand mid. You're probably hurting yourself at some point, but Lissandra is obviously very valuable all the way up, so that can be quite a good champ. And also, I will say that a lot of Lissandra's not picked as much in Halo right now, because a lot of the champs that Lissandra counters are not blinded. You know, a lot of assassins. But in lower elo, when people kind of just play the champs they're good at, as opposed to like what is good in the meta, you actually get much more favorable matchups as Lissandra, and you won't end up versus like more difficult mage matchups like Ori and Syndra nearly as often. So I think another pretty good low elo champ. Seraphine. Seraphine's really, really good for low elo. I think this is another champ that just has high AoE impact. Super simple to just, you know, show up and buff people with all your auras. I think that I guess the difficulty of Seraphine is that you do scale well, but you don't scale as well as like all the other champs in the game normally. Like if your team scales well, you will scale well, but you're not like a solo carry champ. And also, she actually has a pretty high skill cap with her ult, especially. You know, that can be a real game changer, and if you use it really well, then it's great. But it is actually, I think anyway, a pretty hard ability to use. But at the same time, you can just show up to fights and spam your empowered W, your empowered Q, empowered E, you know, just like whatever you have cooldowns for, and just be really impactful. You know, she's kind of like Sona, obviously, but for mid lane. Next two, I want to kind of talk about together, which are Garen and Tryndamere. So the thing with both these champs is, again, they're champs that have a very, very clear win condition. You know, so like for Tryndamere, for example, you're pretty much just going to rage split your way down the side lane. As long as you're just careful not to team fight when you don't have Ghost, you can just, yeah, again, rage split. And as long as you have winning side lane matchups, which you probably will, it's going to be super, super easy. And it's also quite hard, I think, for low elo players to really abuse Tryndamere. You know, so like some of the champs in high elo that can kite Tryndamere out can be quite kind of difficult. But you're honestly just not really going to see it in low elo. It's kind of same with Garen. So like Garen, I actually think Garen's like kind of OP, like low key. But I would say that Garen's weakness is playing against some kind of mage that just ends up scaling very well and kind of getting that scaling for free. But again, in low elo, there's going to be like a lot of fights early, and Garen's scaling is definitely not bad either. Like it's not super good against champs that can peel him off. But in lower elo, when people are like not as good at holding their abilities, when they waste their CCs and stuff like that, you can definitely chew through a team as Garen. So if you're looking for some sort of like off-meta AD pick, you know, you don't want to play an Naafiri or something, you don't want to play an AD carry mid, then one of these could definitely be what you look at. Now, for the rest of the tiers, I'm not going to go through them one by one because there are a lot. So I'll just kind of talk about B tier as a whole and maybe some of the champs that you might be surprised to see in here. So B tier, I think these are champs that some of them are quite forgiving, some of them are quite difficult, but they all have something that makes them reasonably good in low elo. I would say that these are definitely champs you could still pick. It's really only the C and D tiers that I would kind of like stay away from. But I'll give you some examples. So like a champ like Lissandra has good scaling. She has like some higher skill cap, right? Like there are a lot of combos and stuff on Lissandra that can make things more difficult. The difficulty of playing Lissandra in low elo is that she has like big positioning requirements, and also you've got to be really careful how you use your E. So stuff like that makes it more difficult, and that's why I'd recommend something that's like more forgiving. But like I said, scaling is very good for low elo, so definitely a champ you can look at. I will talk specifically about Aurora. So I think Aurora is a champ that currently, as I'm making this video, is a lot easier than she's intended to be. So right now, Aurora ult just does way too much damage. So you can just show up to a fight, drop the ult on people, and that's going to top damage pretty much straight away. It's kind of like having a giant Orianna ult that you can just drop on 4 people and it just nukes them instantly. So this is getting nerfed next patch, but I actually think for now, even though Aurora is going to have this really high skill cap because of the way she plays, right now, I mean, just lock this shit in, build like Malignance, Shadow Flame, Malignance Liandry, Malignance Death Cap, whatever, pretty much, but start with Malignance and just drop your R on people as often as possible. It's super, super strong. Some of the other champs, I guess you might be surprised to see down here and maybe could see higher. Maybe a champ like Asol. So a champ like Asol has really good scaling, and I could see that being higher in low elo. The thing is, though, I've noticed like when I coach Asols that they tend to play very passively in the early game, even though Asol's a champ that actually should bully the 1v1 a lot. So for that reason, I have him a little bit lower. What else do we have on here that could be a bit higher? You know, maybe a champ like Veigar just because of his simplicity. But again, it's a champ that is a mobile. It's a champ that's very gankable, and honestly, Veigar's scaling is good, but again, he has like very short range, which can make things kind of difficult. Like there is positioning requirements. So there's just some kind of like, yeah, some risk factor to him or some skill required for positioning, whereas some of these champs like Ahri or Lux would like let you get away with that without having to commit yourself so far forward. Are there anything else in here that's like really crazy? I don't think so. I think, again, most of the B tier, these are champs that are still like fairly solid and low elo, but are just like a bit more difficult to execute on either their gameplay or their game plan. So I would like, yeah, if you want free elo, you probably pick for up here, but B tier champs are completely fine. Let's talk about C tier. So C tier champs, I think, are overall starting to get towards the more difficult side of things. These are champs that either have like somewhat niche win cons or just have like little gimmicks to them. So for example, you know, like Rumble heat management, or you know, like Zoe's a very unique champ. Ezreal and Zeri require a lot of mechanics. Kao's a lot about like playing defensive lane. Nico is a whole different can of worms. I will say that Nico, kind of similar to Taliyah, can have high impact even if you don't fully utilize her kit. But at the same time, she doesn't have the same like, scaling win condition that a champ like Taliyah has. So you really do need to make sure you're getting stuff out of your early game. Finally, D tier. So I think these are champs that I would definitely stay away from in low elo. I will say that like these champs are definitely good in low elo if you're good at them. You know, like people always come to my stream and they say, "Hey, Shok, what do you think of X champ in low elo?" Actually, Azir is probably the most common one. And it's like, yes, this champ is good in low elo if you can play it. The reason is that even though there are a lot of fights in early game, Azir will absolutely demolish his lane against some of the more off-meta champs. He scales insanely well, and when games are going long, that's really, really nice. The problem is, though, there's a lot of skill required to Azir. There's a lot of points of failure. It's really hard to have consistent impact. Like, you can easily have like a real banger team fight and then, you know, dash in the next fight and just instantly die, right? So it can be pretty rough. And it's kind of the same for most of these D tier champs. Like, they all have something about them that makes them very difficult. For example, Ryze's short range, plus like really needs to get stuff done in the early game. LeBlanc is extremely hard to farm on. Same with Akali, plus she needs to find flanks. Aurelia and Yasuo have like very high mechanical difficulty, plus like a side lane requirement. So it's just stuff like that. Overall, I would stay away from D tier. So I think that's going to be it for this video. Like I said, I'm not going to go through literally every champ. Again, I do have explanations for all the champs on this list if you want to go through and look at some of my older videos. But yeah, I guess once again, I just think the low elo tier lists don't end up changing a lot. They will mostly be the simpler and like high AoE champs tend to be more valuable, especially champs that have scaling win cons or can very easily deal their damage or utility without like too much kind of burden of execution on you or on your teammates. Because that's the thing as well, is that, you know, some champs down here, I mean, like LeBlanc, really benefit from receiving ganks, right? And so like maybe in lower elo, when you have no ganking jungle, no ganking support, that might be a bit harder to come by. So yeah, anyway, that's kind of what I think of everything. Feel free to let me know in the comment section if you disagree. Otherwise, come to my stream. Feel free to ask me questions. Thank you guys again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.